Jim Breslow. Find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Watch our YouTube channel, Hidden Truth Show. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast app. Here's Jim Breslow.
Welcome back to the Hidden Truth Show. Today we have a distinguished law professor, author, and host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, David Harris. Harris is promoting his brand new book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Police Confrontations. It tells the true story of an 18-year-old Jordan Miles and 3 Pittsburgh police officers. Jordan, a high school honors student with no police record, encounters the police outside his home. He emerges from the confrontation bruised and beaten. The police charge him with serious crimes. He swears he did nothing wrong. When the story becomes public, an American city faces protests, deep division, and a long quest for justice. The book takes an in-depth look at the opposing stories and at race and the fear it incites to find answers. Harris and I have a much-needed open discussion about race and police in America without fear and without regard to political correctness. We talk about whether applying stereotypes to blacks is inherently racist. We discuss the talk that black parents feel obligated to give their children about interaction with the police. Is the talk really necessary? What exactly is the talk? What should it be? And shouldn't the talk be given by all parents to all children? Before we get to the interview, I want to remind you about our new membership offer. For just $5 per month, you can become a truther. Your membership entitles you to special episodes, personal emails from me, email access to me, and an embroidered truther baseball cap. And for those of you enjoying our series on Tic Tac UFOs, we have a special episode for members. We have released the Daily Star's recording of Simon Green's interview of Mike Turber and me. For those of you still trying to figure out whether Turber is to be believed, this is a must listen. So join us now. Go to patreon.com/Hidden Truth Show, patreon.com/Hidden Truth Show to join. We have to support independent voices in the media. With the obvious bias of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, and Silicon Valley conglomerates picking and choosing what speech is permitted, it's more important than ever for shows like ours to exist, and we exist only with your support. So please support us by going to Patreon and becoming a truther for just $5 per month. Okay, now for our interview with law professor David Harris about his book, Race, Fear, and the Law. I started by asking Harris to tell us the true story behind the book. And please excuse the technical difficulties in this interview. You'll notice my voice sounds a little funny in the first 10 minutes. We get it corrected after about 10 minutes of the interview.
This story starts just about 10 years ago here in Pittsburgh in a neighborhood called Homewood. Homewood is your typical high crime area in an urban setting, and it involves 4 people, 3 plainclothes Pittsburgh police officers who were tasked with finding guns and drugs in high crime areas, and a high school senior named Jordan Miles. This incident was violent, and people got hurt. But if there was one incident, there are very clearly 2 different stories. From the police point of view, what the police say is that they were patrolling down one of the streets in this neighborhood, and they saw a man who looked to be lurking up against a house. They came around to confront the man. The man stopped when they told him to, started to answer their questions, but they saw immediately, they thought that he was armed. They saw telltale signs from their training. When the man began to run away, the police tackled him. They had to use physical force to subdue him. After they did that, and the was on, they saw the man's hand go toward his pocket where they had seen the telltale bulge of a gun. And in that moment, fear hit everybody. They feared they're going to be shot, so they began to really beat the guy and hit him hard in the head, and finally he gave up the struggle. They searched him and didn't find a gun. Didn't find a gun in his pocket. Didn't find a gun anywhere. But they arrested him and charged him with felonies.
And how badly was he beaten?
He was badly beaten enough that his face was terribly disfigured, and some hair seemed to have been pulled out of his scalp. He was He was beaten badly enough that when his mother first saw him, when he was bailed out of jail, she did not recognize him. His story is different. He comes out of the house. He sees three very large men jump out of a car. They're dressed like regular people, not like police. The car is unmarked, and they start screaming at him, "Where are your guns? Where's your drugs? Where's your money?" And he thought he was going to be robbed, so he immediately tried to run, and the men were on him like that. They beat him, and finally he gave up when he was hit in the head. That was his point where he said, "I thought I was going to die." And he didn't realize that they were police until much later. This double story, if you like, one incident, two stories. There's lots in the book about what happened, and I'm confident readers will be able to come to their own conclusions. But the bigger question here is why this happened. How did this relatively small, 5'6", 150-pound kid who goes to the art school in Pittsburgh, who's a viola player, who's never had any trouble with the cops of any kind, is on the honor roll, how does he end up at the bottom of a pile of very large policemen beating on him? How does that happen? How does it keep happening every day in cities all over the country? Those are the questions that really intrigue me. I mean, for one thing, it was right on my doorstep. This happened less than 2 miles from where I live. And it just divided our city. But for me, the real question was why this keeps happening, whether there's anything we could do to keep it from being a constant occurrence.
Yeah, and it's all of these kind of individual incidents that incite these days of protests and
That's right.
rage and a lot of strong feelings on both sides.
It did that very thing here, yes.
Yeah. Yet each one of these incidents is so unique. Yours in particular that you wrote about is especially unique considering the fact that the officers were in plain clothes.
Yes.
So I guess the first question is, why were they in plain clothes as opposed to in their uniforms?
It's not too unusual to have plainclothes officers in an unmarked car for purposes of surreptitious patrols. This was a special unit, and the task of this unit was to find guns and drugs, not to respond to 911 calls, let's say, or emergencies of any kind, but to just be on kind of stealth patrol through these heavy crime areas looking for the violence and the causes of violence.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before. I don't know that much about policing. I guess I just kind of assume that you go in plain clothes if you're surveilling somebody and don't want to be seen, but just general patrolling of a bad neighborhood in plain clothes. Let me get your quick analysis of that. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's a good question, and I think what they would tell you is that this is a form of surveillance. That they are, they're going around the neighborhood and not supposed to be recognized, so that people who are out there and up to no good, they'll have a chance to catch them unawares. Now, this has real problems.
As far as being so-called undercover, it's three white guys in a black neighborhood. I mean, that doesn't sound very discreet to me.
Well, and that was a point that came up a number of times during the trial, both in terms of the utility of that, whether that's a good idea, but also because the implication was, well, then you just have to know they were police. In point of fact, there are white people in that neighborhood on a regular basis. Some live there, though the majority of population is black. Some do business there. There are tradespeople. They come and go, and some are up to no good. So it's more mixed than all one race. But the real problem is here that these units are often under a lot less control and supervision than regular uniformed units who have to respond. These guys are kind of out there on their own. Mm-hmm. And it can be a recipe for things going wrong. We've seen this in other cities too, where you have these specialized units who really are kind of given a lot more autonomy than the regular patrol officer. Things can go bad if you don't have good people in place.
Well, again, if they're trying to surveil and be semi-undercover, it would tend to make sense that perhaps they would engage with this person without immediately disclosing that they are police. Because that's kind of the whole point.
Yeah, and that is the interesting point. They were very specific, the officers were, when they testified. We immediately got out of the car and announced Pittsburgh Police and held up our badges. that they wear on a lanyard around their necks. Of course, the kid says they didn't do that.
Did their three stories vary in any way in that regard?
No, they did not. They were very consistent. These are very experienced officers. They've testified dozens and dozens of times in court, written even more reports than that. So their stories were all consistent.
And how were their individual records, these three police officers? Any prior record of bad behavior?
Well, there were some records of this kind of thing happening before, that they would come upon a person, simply get out of the vehicle and start in on them without so much as announcing who they were. But that evidence did not make it into court. The judge did not allow it to come in because these were disciplinary records and they were thought to be highly prejudicial. So the judge kept them out and away from the jurors.
Wow, that's surprising. So you're saying there was prior record of these very same officers not announcing that they were police officers?
I found at least one documented incident like that, and according to what I found, there were others too. There were other disciplinary infractions that had been noted by their supervisors, but all of that was kept out of the trial. When I say the trial, I mean it was a civil trial. The officers were not charged criminally. The federal government and the district attorney did not bring charges.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me, my analysis of it, again, I haven't read the book, but read quite a bit about it and seen some of your interviews and about this incident, that there very well could be an innocent explanation on both sides. It's very possible that they did announce themselves, but the kid didn't hear them. It's dark, so perhaps he doesn't see the badges. I see no reason for this kid, who you're saying was an exemplary student, no prior records, no gang behavior, etc. Why would he go running if he has nothing to hide, right?
I think that's the reaction of a lot of people. And the answer, I think, can be, number one, from what he said, he heard no identification of them at all. They completely took him by surprise, and he was just terrified he was about to get robbed or worse, and started to run. But even if, and I do treat this in the book, even if you assume that he knew they were police, and he denies that, but let's assume that he did know, it's not unreasonable in a situation like that for a young African-American man to avoid the police and even run from them, because you know, as a black person, as he would, that being completely innocent and doing nothing wrong is not enough to secure your safety or your freedom. That's a very difficult fact for the other persons like us to swallow, because we don't live in that world. But that is, in fact, his world.
Yeah. Well, now you're really jumping right into the heart of the controversial stuff, and maybe we'll bounce back and forth a little bit between the lessons learned in this incident itself. But while arguably blacks may have reason to fear police, and that's a very controversial notion in and of itself, whether blacks should fear police or not, or frankly, whether anyone should fear police, whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics, etc. But even if there is a good basis for a black kid of his age to fear the police, that is not justification for running away from the police.
Well, it's not legal justification, that's for sure. If they have a legal right to stop you, and we'll assume that for purposes of your question, no, he's not justified in doing that in a legal sense.
And I don't think that,
from the point of view of his own safety, he may just think, I've got to get out of here. And it's a sad fact, but it's a true one.
But it seems to me, and again, now I'm getting into the higher level stuff, I mean, when you review each of these anecdotal situations one at a time, what you usually see is a situation where the individual is not obeying the police, is not doing exactly what they tell him to do. I mean, maybe you've studied this far more than me, but I can't think of a case where I've seen where the interaction between the individual and the police was, yes, sir, whatever you want, sir, here's my arm, here's this and that. There always seems to be something where there is some resistance to what the police officer is asking the individual to do, which ends up resulting in the situation getting escalated. So I'm just saying I'd be very cautious about us suggesting that oh, you've got good reason to fear the police, so it's understandable that he runs from the police because once you stop doing what the officer asks you to do, you're now putting yourself in a bit of jeopardy.
Yeah,
and I would argue
question.
not necessarily wrongly so. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I catch your meaning. It's a balancing of risks. That's very clear. What you have to keep in mind is that we don't see all of the interactions that go perfectly fine. We only see the ones that go wrong, and some of them go wrong on the civilian side, some on the police side, some on both. I'm not denying that. But there are millions of others every day and every year that go just fine, and those work out. These are the smallest number, but they are a consistent pattern. And for young Black folks, their world is just different than your world and my world. It's simply different. And this is knowledge that's handed down generationally. It's their own experience. They know it's different, and therefore some of them in the moment will make a decision that you and I never would.
Right. And so here's where it gets a little bit circular, that the more that a Black person or Black people are subscribed to the belief that the police are to be feared, the more likely they are not to respond properly when interacting with police, causing then the police to respond differently to them. The way I was always raised and thought and taught and so on is that you do whatever the heck a police officer tells you to do, period. You don't run from them. You stop. It's yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, this or that. You do not egg on the police. I've got buddies from college who used to enjoy egging on the police. These aren't Black people, white people. And it did not go well for them. They had bad experiences with the police because they didn't do what I always do with the police, which is yes, sir, no, sir. So, so you probably recognize what I'm seeing as kind of the circular element that, okay, on the one hand, oh, Blacks, you've got good reason not to trust the police. And if you raise somebody to believe you got to be careful about police, you're going to have situations where a guy's running from police when he should be doing exactly what the police said. And if you run from the police, nothing good happens in those situations.
I would agree with you that nothing good happens, that's for sure. But enough times, enough people have direct experience in your own life, and you have your own experiences with very negative interactions with the police. Because, see, this is on both sides of the interaction. This is not just Black people fearing the police. Police fear Black people too. And we can talk a lot about that if you want. Things go wrong because this interaction has problems on both sides. But what we're talking about is a situation where somebody like this kid has heard these stories. I mean, your initial question to me is, why would he run? Why would anybody run? You and I wouldn't, but lots of people just don't live in the same world that you and I do. And because of that, there's fear and difficulty on both sides of these interactions, and things tend to go real wrong. And you look at what's in the media, you look at what gets reported, you look at the things that go terribly, catastrophically wrong, and too often it does seem to me it involves a young person of color. Now, they may have some of the blame in any given situation. You're right, any of those could be different. But when that happens, that becomes a narrative that is in the person's head, and they respond to it.
Yeah, but is there a risk that by talking about cases such as the one you talk about in your book, by elevating these rare situations, because as you point out, this is the exception rather than the rule, that people tend to overblow in their mind the extent to which cops are racist or you need to fear cops, etc., when we all generally seem to subscribe to the idea that, 99% are good, there's bad apples, but let's not let those bad apples ruin it for everybody else. And let's not focus on the bad apples, let's focus on the 99% that are good.
I don't think there's anything that I could do that would make that experience, that existing narrative greater than it already is. What you find when you talk to Black people is that from the time a kid is 12, 13, 14, and certainly by the time the kid is 15 and 16 getting ready to drive. Black parents sit their children down and they tell them, here is what you do when you get stopped by the police. And it isn't just the kind of talking to that you and I got, where your dad or your mom says, do everything the police officer says and better not hear your mouthing off. These are survival instructions. They are where you put your hands, and here's what you don't do, and don't move. And this kind of thing is instructed into people from an early age because parents know the real danger out there. And when it's already that deep, the danger of me exaggerating it is nil. So I wanted to tell this story because it's important as one thing we can look at to see how we can improve things.
Oh yeah, and for sure, I don't mean to call out your book. I think talking about these things and the issues that it raises is critical, and hence the reason I want to talk to you. But I do think that anecdotal bad incidents between blacks and police can tend to make it appear that this is a problem that's bigger than it is. When you ask most people, even experts such as yourself, you would still say that, hey, 99% are good. There's the 1% that are bad. But you brought up something that's top of mind for me as far as something I wanted to talk about with you in this interview, and that is the talk, because that's what it's kind of called these days, and that's what you're referring to there with the black parents having the talk. So start by just walking me through, best that you understand it from what you've heard and so on. What is the talk? Exactly what does the parent say to the child?
Well, if you'd like to actually have your listeners or viewers get a sort of firsthand look, there's a video out there I'd highly recommend called Dear Child. You can find it on YouTube. What the talk is how a parent will instruct a kid, usually of driving age, about the realities of the world. If they don't know them already, they have to know that police are going to pay extra attention to you because of how you look. Because you are black, because you are brown, you are going to get extra attention. And some of that attention will not be positive. In fact, some of it is going to be very negative. And what the parent instructs the child to do is to never lose their cool, to do exactly and only what the police officer says to do, to keep hands in view at all times unless instructed to do something else. If something is said that is rude or nasty or even racist, do not be provoked. Do not say anything. Nobody can win an argument on the street except a police officer. And what we, the parents, are worried about is your physical safety. We want you to come home, and therefore these instructions are paramount. If we have a complaint, we'll take it to the police department afterwards. We'll be with you for that. But out there, you must survive. You must survive, because this is a situation in which young people of color get killed, and we don't want that to happen to you. That's really the guts of it.
Do we know whether Jordan Miles had the talk?
What I do know is that he didn't drive yet. So I don't think he had. I think I remember asking about that. And in point of fact, what I remember learning was that he was raised by his mother and his grandmother. His father wasn't really in the picture. And his mother and grandmother, he said, and they repeated this to me in separate interviews, had always told him, respect the police, they're there to help you. And there was a gentleman who was sometimes in the home as a friend who was a police officer, and Jordan said, I admired him, he was a nice man, and so forth.
So he doesn't sound like the type of kid that would have run if he knew that they were police. I know you're saying it could be understandable that maybe he did run and know they were police, but really it seems that he did not know that they were police.
Well, that's one piece of evidence that would say he didn't know, yes.
Yeah. So going back to the talk, I like everything about that talk, except the part that I question is telling your child, telling them what to do when interacting with police, perfect. Why do you need to add on top of that, oh, and by the way, police are going to be coming to get you, and you're unique and different, and you got to really watch out for them because they don't necessarily like your type, or however you're going to say that, but basically alerting the child that police go after black people. Why is that part important to tell the kid as opposed to simply obey the police?
Well, because it's true for them. I mean, that's the lived experience of black people.
We said, right. But we're acknowledging that 99% are good. So, to highlight the 1% bad, I'm just not sure that that's great for the psyche of a kid to be. I'm just not sure that that's important to be highlighted to a kid. As long as you've highlighted the most important part, which is obey the police, I just don't see the benefit of the other part.
Well, you and I aren't black. I didn't instruct my kids that way either. And I wasn't instructed that way. But the reality of black life in this country has been, since time out of mind, that they suffer mistreatment at the hands of police much more often. And I don't know that I'd be nailed to the figure of 99%. I mean, if we want to go into the statistics, they're all there in the book. What I would say is most police interactions go ahead and take place without any incident, but it's more likely to happen to people who are black and brown that things go wrong. And that's not something we could ignore. And I don't think I'm in a position to tell black parents, well, you're going too far with that. Mm-hmm. That if that is what happens to kids, and the kid is going to say, why? I mean, why do I have to show my hands? What's really going on with that, mom or dad? How would the parent explain it?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about.
My father never had the reason to.
Let's talk about the difference between racism and stereotyping. And do you see a difference between those two? Because
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it could be very possible be that blacks are a quote unquote victim of stereotyping without it being racism. Do you agree with that?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. And you have to break racism down, I think, too. I mean, we're too likely in this country, especially people maybe my age. I don't know about you, but when people think racism, a lot of folks think, well, you got to say that word out loud. You got to be willing to express those kind of things, like Archie Bunker in the old TV show. That's one type of this problem, one aspect of it, but more subtle forms of what we call implicit bias or stereotyping that can unknowingly alter our behavior. Those are two pretty close things. Those have actually more of an impact than people really realize or understand. They're very widespread throughout society, including, by the way, in black communities too. The testing and the studying of these things for decades now, over millions and millions of experiments and administrations, is pretty clear. That kind of bias is actually very common. And what we have to understand is how this works, not just on the overt level of people who use that N-word, but on the level of people whose behavior is influenced by what you're calling stereotypes, and how that might impact a situation like a police interaction. I give you one example. Many examples in the book of studies and so forth. I don't want to get all nerdy on you, but let's just give one example. One team of scientists exposed experimental subjects, both white and black, to a photo of a black person's face. After seeing a black person's face, what's called a prime of a black person's face, a priming, they had much more of an ability to pick the outlines of a weapon out of a degraded, hard-to-see visual image. They were more likely to pay attention to thoughts and hints about crime. And when somebody was primed with suggestions about crime, their eyes automatically went to pictures of African-American faces in a crowd. All of this and an additional number of experiments that went along with it showed that seeing a black person is effectively a visual tuning device for the brain. All right. It brings thoughts of crime, and when there are thoughts of crime, it brings you to black people. All of this would tend to explain, like many other pieces of evidence that are out there, that these situations are not neutral because of what you call stereotypes. Those things exist, and they have an effect on people's behavior.
So, two questions. First is, what has caused that stereotype? How did that stereotype come about?
Yeah. Well, that takes us back a long, long way. There's been evidence of that the dominant stereotype of African Americans in this country brings to mind for most people violence, crime, and danger. Those three things. And there's
but it brings it to mind. It brings it to mind. Why? Is it because there's been a history of a greater percentage of crime among blacks than whites?
There are greater numbers of arrests and greater records of imprisonment, but those things are not the same thing as greater amounts of criminality. This comes from the culture that we all grow up in. I said earlier that this was the dominant stereotype in American life of black people. It exists in the minds of black people too. It is not just a white people thing. And it goes back literally decades. Have you ever seen the doll studies done by Dr. Kenneth Clark, or the updates of them, where they show these little kids, 5, 6, 7 years old, identical dolls? One is black and one is white. This is very basic science, and in certain ways it works, and in certain ways it doesn't. But then they ask the kids questions like, which one is the pretty doll? They pick the white doll. Which one is the mean doll? They pick the black doll. So on and so on.
Right.
And this work was so well established, and the stereotypes so deep, even as of 1950, that this stuff was cited in Brown versus Board of Education. So it comes from the culture. It comes from our caregivers. It comes from our parents.
Right, but we're talking specifically now about crime, and when we hear about all the killings in Chicago, it's not white people killing white people. It's black people killing black people. I mean, the crime rate in the black community is certainly higher than in the white community. I'm not saying it has anything to do with their race. It has to do with the fact that it's inner city, and there's poverty, and there's all kinds of issues with the inner city. But it's obviously crime is more common in poor inner cities around the world. And our poor inner cities happen to have a great percentage of blacks. So the percentage of crime among blacks is higher. I don't think that we can ignore that.
No, the percentage of crime among people who are poor is higher.
Okay.
Right.
And in the U.S., it happens to be, unfortunately, blacks.
Yeah, it's a correlation. It's not a causation. Okay?
Right,
and I think it's very important to separate that. You would find that in any poor community, like you said, anywhere in the world where there's deprivation, where there's poor education, where there's poor family structure. Those can be any kind of communities that really doesn't involve race. That's the way that people are growing up and the way they respond to problems. Another aspect to that is that for years, the justice system, whether it's police or courts, whatever, have not been responsive in those communities. And so people, and this is extremely unfortunate, people are more likely to take things in their own hands when they want some measure of satisfaction. They don't want the police in their communities. That is the sign of a real breakdown. And so we get some violence from that too.
Yeah. So if the crime is primarily in the inner city, the question is, do you want more policing in the inner city or not? You would think you would, but if you have this back and forth where the inner city is not trusting the police and saying, stay out of my community, then you're going to there's going to be a lot of law-abiding people in that community not very happy that they're losing their police presence.
It's a terribly difficult problem. For years, black communities have had a twin problem. It's both over-enforcement and under-enforcement. Right? When they call the police don't come. When they come, sometimes they don't arrest the people who are responsible, and the folks who called end up on the wrong side of the police. This is something that does not happen in my community, and they don't want that sort of policing done. it is perfectly true that you can have a good police presence in poor communities, but it has to be a presence that people want.
Yeah.
You know, if what they think is you're going to have the New York treatment under both Giuliani and Bloomberg, where basically every young kid gets stopped and frisked every time you send them down to the corner store, they don't want that kind of policing. So you can have lots of police there, and the crime rate can even be going down, and people will still resent the police presence. It's a very difficult problem. It's a question of the difference between having it done to you and done with you.
Back to stereotyping. Is stereotyping inherently bad or wrong? I mean, don't you want the police looking with more suspicion at a 20-year-old male than a 70-year-old female?
A 20-year-old male versus a 70-year-old female? Yes, I do. I do want them looking more at one than the other. The problem comes in when we look at whole communities through those stereotyping lenses, and that's really been a difficult problem for.
Well, but I just identified sex and age. So you're saying you're okay with it based on sex and age, but
those actually do. Those have causative effects. Other things are too dangerous to use that way. Now, if I have a description, if I'm a police officer and there's a description of a guy who just robbed the 7-Eleven, and he's described as wearing, red sweatsuit, high top Nikes, San Jose Sharks cap, and he's black, I'm not going to ignore that he's black. That's part of a description. That's legitimate. What I don't think is legitimate and what is in fact dangerous is to say, store robbed by a black kid, let's just look for black kids. Even though that is one factor, it's not definite enough. And too often, policing has been done at that level. Smart policing doesn't work that way. They wouldn't use stereotypes. They would use real descriptions when they have them. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Race is a good descriptor. In fact, it's better than clothes. You can take your clothes off and change them. You can't change your race.
So going back to the 18-year-old Jordan Miles, if it were a 70-year-old woman with a bulge in her jacket, this wouldn't have happened?
Probably not. Probably not.
So the question is, are we okay with the stereotype of responding differently to a black male, a young black male, versus, well, let's just say the real question here, which is a young white male. Let's make it about white and black.
Yep. Yeah.
If it is true, let's just suppose it's true, because I think the statistics bear it out that there's a higher rate among young black males than there are young white males. Is it okay for the police to use that stereotype as they think about this guy they're looking at and that bulge in his pocket, and whether that bulge is more or less likely to be a gun?
I would say what you need to look for is the bulge, not who's got it. Okay?
But if it's the old lady with the bulge, you would feel
grandma, that's a whole different thing. All right. Crime is a young person's game, and that's universally acknowledged. It's true. It's backed up by statistics.
And it's also a male
who gets arrested.
And more
it's male. That's right.
It's more black.
It's not necessarily more black. What happens is you get more police in those neighborhoods who are looking for it. Right? Take drugs. Okay? Drugs is a little easier. Drugs are everywhere. People use drugs in direct proportion to their proportion of the United States population. Nobody uses it more or less often by race. And yet, there are many more police patrols in what we call high crime areas. So if you looked at the arrest statistics, you'd find a lot more young black people getting arrested for those things and going to prison for them.
But is that because the business...
That's where the opportunity is.
Well, but also the business of drugs is taking place in those communities. The gangs
It takes place everywhere.
Business.
It takes place everywhere. Everywhere. People buy it from people in their own racial groups.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you, but I'm just saying gangs are the ones that have turned this into a big criminal enterprise, and that's taking place in those areas, and you're trying to bust those enterprises as opposed to the guy who sells you a bag of weed, at your local 7-Eleven or what have you.
That may be, but remember that's a consequence of how we set up our policing. We could bust the guy in the 7-Eleven if we wanted to, That would be
Right.
easy enough.
But
It
are
would
you
take some
busting
more
a big
effort,
criminal
maybe.
enterprise? Police have to
Might
put
be,
the
yeah.
resources, where you're likely.
Right.
But that leads to, I think, a really important question that relates to all this, and that is drugs. I mean, that was a question you said these officers asked about, give us your guns and your drugs.
Yes.
So it just struck me like, man, what are we doing out there? Look at all the harm and things that are happening as a result of these drug laws, that these police feel that they need to go and risk their lives in these communities, put in jeopardy other people's lives. And what were they trying to do? They're trying to see if he's got drugs on him.
Yeah.
Alcohol is legal. Everybody now, basically, at this point, marijuana is basically legal in this country. I mean, I think if you polled the country, they probably, and it's just dropping state by state. So you already got alcohol, you got marijuana, you got prescription drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got our police out there worrying about a drug transaction happening on the street in the inner city. It just seems absurd.
It is absurd. And we are slowly but surely coming to our senses as a country. There's a huge industry behind wanting to enforce these laws and lock people up behind them. And that won't be easy to overcome. But we already have, 10, 11 states in the District of Columbia where it's legal for all purposes. And it's illegal as medicine in how many more, including my own, Pennsylvania. It's absurd to think that we're ever going to do anything but lose the war on drugs, and so far that's pretty much all we've done. I'm not saying drugs are harmless. They're certainly not. I'm not saying that people wouldn't be better off doing less of it, but they'd be better off doing, drinking less too. But we just allow that to go on because we saw the folly of that after Prohibition.
Anything you make illegal creates an underground business.
Absolutely.
And enforcement.
Yeah, and that's where the guns come in.
Yeah,
that's right. Because they didn't just jump out. They jump out of the car, not just saying where's your drugs, but where's your gun.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're going to get ripped off as a dealer, you're not going to call the cops. It's the big deterrent. It's what you have to be ready to do.
The question I have is, sorry to interrupt, but you're talking about gangs, is that, clearly gangs are in the business of dealing drugs. If we legalize drugs, that whole business dries up for them. My only slight concern would be, are they going to turn to some other criminal behavior? I don't know what that would be, but, these cartels south of the border, they seem to be morphing into other businesses, whether it be, human trafficking, shaking down the local businesses, protection money, et cetera. They're not going away. They just grow into other things. So I would love to see drugs legalized because I think that it takes away a ton of illegal dollars, and there's just so many benefits to it. That's a whole nother show.
No, I completely agree with you, and we could then turn to treating it like what it is, which is a public health problem. And there are countries that have done this, not countries as big as ours, but if you look at Portugal basically legalized everything, not just weed, years ago. And their numbers of overdoses went down dramatically. The amount of public funds they have to spend to suppress it went way down.
But am I right that they decriminalized it, but they didn't legalize it?
They decriminalized it, but it is for all intents and purposes legal up to the personal use amounts.
But let me ask you this question: if can you buy it there? At, if you know about MedMen in California, here we have MedMen, which is the 7-Eleven of marijuana retailers. Do they have that where it's actually taxed and you can buy it legitimately?
I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that they have enough of a legal hook, not a criminal hook, but that when they find somebody who's in distress out on the street, they can take them in. And they require them to sit for kind of an interview with a panel of people. One person could be a cop, but it's basically social workers and doctors. And they try to get the person into treatment. and make sure that their, whatever health needs they might have are seen to, whether it's depression meds or clean needles or whatever. So it's reducing the harm very drastically, and now it's just not the kind of problem it was for them.
Yeah, well,
now, that's a small country.
We did a deep dive here on the 12-step program, which I am not a fan of because its success rate is extremely low. There's all kinds of medical developments now, and basically have demonstrated that this is a form of a mental illness. And so I 100% agree. This whole idea that, the person's just weak, or what's wrong with this loser who keeps going back to drugs or keeps going back to alcohol, and the parents kick him out of the house. It's like, this person has a mental disorder. This person needs psychiatric. Disease. Yeah, it's a disease disorder, but they need medical attention from an MD. And there are things out there for these people. Have you heard of this drug naltrexone for
yes,
alcoholics? I had never heard of this. It's generic now. A friend of mine's life was basically saved by naltrexone. He had been in and out of 12-step for many years, but he takes this drug now, and when you take it, you don't feel the effects of alcohol. And there's things out there for other drugs also that are similar medications, not to mention things for depression or so on. Whatever's causing somebody to self-medicate with these alcohol and drugs. There's things out there that addiction specialists can provide, but
absolutely
getting people access to it or to even know about it is very difficult.
Yes, indeed. You're right. I mean, it's just what we do with drugs in this country is stupid on the best day.
Let's cover one more kind of hot button issue before we let you go, and that's criminal justice reform, which, first of all, maybe you should define it for us, but you're hearing a lot about criminal justice reform.
Yes.
And from what I understand, it seems to be about reducing sentences for certain crimes and eliminating certain criminal laws. It seems to me also there's kind of an underlying element that these laws are either inherently discriminatory or being enforced in a discriminatory manner, and therefore they should be tossed out.
Yeah. Well, criminal justice reform is a pretty broad banner. It includes attention to mass incarceration, and we incarcerate at a rate that is just higher than any other country. And we do so for lengths of time that are higher than basically almost anywhere in the world. We are right up there with our good friends China and Iran.
And why is our rate so high? Why is it such a high percentage?
It is because we are a more punitive country in the sense that we use the criminal sanction where a lot of other countries just don't for a lot of things.
So they would do what instead? Just fine you or put you on probation or something?
They would fine you. It would be a civil infraction. And we put people away for so much longer than most other Western industrialized countries. I mean, when people hear about what we do, they are a little surprised. I can tell you that.
Do you think it's again the drug laws? Is that what's making up the bulk of it?
That's only part of it. That's only part of it. I mean, we use the life without parole sanction, for instance, pretty indiscriminately, much more so than almost any other country. We use solitary confinement in ways that basically you don't see outside of a place like Iran. But incarceration is really only one piece of criminal justice reform. It includes reforming cash bail systems. It includes getting rid of mandatory minimum sentences. It includes changes to drug laws like we were just talking about, whether decriminalization, full legalization, or something else. And it includes the impact. I mean, what you said is really true. It's sometimes the laws themselves are fine. It's how we're enforcing them. It's who they're getting enforced against. It's where they're getting enforced as opposed to other places. One of the reasons that, frankly, prohibition all those years ago, which was like a national mental illness. Who knows why we did that? But one of the reasons that people saw it as wrong was how unfairly it was enforced all those years ago. If you had a little money and you knew where the speakeasy was, you'd get right in, drink all you wanted. If you were poor, it just wasn't the same. And we've got the same kind of things going on now. So all of these make up the broad arena of criminal justice reform. And what is so interesting about it is how the left and the right, which agree on almost nothing else, have kind of come together around this. You have support from the Koch brothers and George Soros. for the same sets of issues. For instance, just to pick two people who could not be further apart.
And what role does race play in this whole movement, would you say?
I say it plays a big role because what we see when we look at mass incarceration is African Americans, brown people generally are disproportionately represented. Now, there are arguments, just the same as you made to me a few minutes ago, well, this is a result of over-offending. But the data don't really support that, except in a few very discrete categories. When we talk about drug enforcement, when we talk about other things, they are overrepresented. They get longer sentences, they get denied bail or have to meet high cash bails, and they get harsher treatment from the system generally than white people do across a variety of dimensions. It's just true. That's the data support this, and they've supported it for years and years. So race is an issue in terms of how the system works, even if the laws are perfectly neutral on their face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just concerns me to an extent that plays too large of a role in, because if they're offending at a higher rate, then that explains it. I just don't like the idea of saying that, because this law adversely impacts this community at a higher rate, that makes the law discriminatory or racist. And that's not necessarily
not on
the
its face. No, not on its face. It depends on how and where it's enforced.
Yeah.
Right. And the drug laws are exhibit number one, because those get enforced at higher rates against people doing the same thing as everybody else.
And then the question again is, if you want less enforcement, do the law-abiding citizens of these inner city communities want less enforcement? I can tell you personally, I wish in my community there was more police. I hardly ever see a police car at all. I would be very happy, other than me having to obey the speed limit. But other than that, I'd be very happy to see more police, the merrier. For me.
Yeah, I don't think you would find anybody who's a real citizen in the black community saying we want less enforcement. What they might say to you is they want a different kind of enforcement. I don't think there's any real argument but that the police have enforced the law differently in black communities, whether it's ignoring citizen complaints, that under enforcement thing I talked about a few minutes ago, or just doing it in ways that would never be acceptable outside of black and brown communities. They want to have good, solid, responsible enforcement. And my experience is that when they get that, they're quite happy. They like it. They support it. What they don't like is the type of enforcement they've often gotten, which is sort of just blanket dragnet kinds of enforcement, often with a nice side order of rudeness, if not worse.
Well, maybe that's the last thing we'll touch on then, because I think this ties into that, which is the militarization of the police, the body cams, et cetera. I mean, the guy in the corner that would help the kids across the street kind of police officer doesn't seem to exist anymore. They're all decked out with body armor, cameras, et cetera. It's kind of hard to just be relaxed and be yourself when there's a camera running all the time, whether you're the police officer or the person interacting with the police officer. So how do you feel about this militarization and also specifically body cams?
Militarization is not a good thing for the police, whether it is the overuse of SWAT teams, which is very common, or it's the obtaining by police departments of large-scale military surplus equipment from the Pentagon. These are not good things. They're generally not what the police need, and they put a warrior attitude over enforcement, and that's not healthy. I mean, domestic law enforcement is not a war.
And a lot of that is a post 9/11 thing, right? Where
exactly.
We've had to arm up our local police to be prepared for terrorism, which, I do want them to be prepared for terrorism, but you have what you have now.
Yeah, it's not good. And the way it influences the thinking to turn our police into warriors in a war. I mean, in war, you have casualty. In a war, you have collateral damage, and it's all kind of acceptable. That's not what local policing is or ever should be. On body cameras, I mean, early on, I'll tell you, I was a believer. I was one of the very first people to write a serious academic treatment about body cameras and what they could do, because I saw these things in action before 2010, and I was really taken with them. I think we have to look at it now and say there are some things they can do. They are not, like any technology police get, they are not going to solve every problem, and I think expectations were set much too high for these things. They can record some of what happens in an interaction. They won't get all of it. They only get what's in the lens, and sometimes things will go wrong with them, and sometimes officers will not use them. And what we have as a result is, I think, a pretty imperfect situation where now the community and the people out there, the first thing they say, well, where's the tape? Where's the recording? And if they can't get it immediately, they're dissatisfied. If it doesn't show anything much or show anything definitive, they're dissatisfied. So I'd have to say it's a pretty mixed picture with cameras. The thing is, cameras are out there. They're everywhere. So in a certain sense, law enforcement was just late to the party, right? And they were responding to the fact that they were being recorded all the time. I think what we have to understand is that those cameras can be a good thing. They can help, but they're never going to tell the full story.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think is for sure is it's probably the hardest time ever to be a cop.
It's a difficult job on the best of days, that's for sure. And I think, generally speaking, people understand that. What I think what civilians sometimes have a hard time with is they don't understand why the police never seem to be to blame for anything that goes wrong. Right? I understand that police are brave and they're very courageous people, and they do things that I wouldn't do for twice what they make. As our former president used to say, they're the ones who run toward the danger when the rest of us would run away. I couldn't disagree with any of that. But what I think has been missing from the picture for a long time is police haven't been transparent with the public. And I'm not saying they should disclose details of an investigation before it's over, nothing like that. But too often, not just in Pittsburgh, but pretty much everywhere, the answer has been, we can't tell you that, leave it to us, trust us. And the result has been that people actually have come to trust them less. And that is really bad. That's not good for them, and it's not good for us.
Thank you again to our guest, David Harris. You can go to Amazon to buy his book, and you should also check out his Criminal Injustice podcast. Also go to Patreon to join us. Become a truther for just $5 per month. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. We'll be back with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show next week.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.